All right. So here we have here a Jewish lady meeting another lady. Now, I get these two names twisted, okay? As far as there's Naomi and Ruth. Ruth was the Jewish lady, right? And Naomi was the Moabite lady. And Ruth met Naomi in Moab because Ruth had to leave Jerusalem because of a famine. Huh? Yeah, right. Ruth the Moabite? Okay, I always got these things mixed up. I can think of which one is which. Because it's all seeming to me to be crossing over. But what we have, let's go. I'm going to read these practical points at the back and to go with that. But basically, let's do this. This story takes place around 1100 BC, before Christ, in the place of Moab. Moab was a Gentile city just a little bit southeast or west of Jerusalem. It was on the other side of the Jordan River. And so what we're dealing here with Jews and Gentiles. How did the Jews feel about the Gentiles in general? No, they didn't care for them. Basically, I don't know if this is true or not, but some of the Jewish philosophers would go around saying, now this is really, really derogatory, but they said, the only thing Gentiles are good for is keeping the fires of hell going. Now that's pretty low, okay? And that was generally the consensus between Jews and Gentiles. There was a lot of tension. You talk about racial tension, okay? And it really wasn't a race thing, it wasn't a color thing, because they looked pretty much the same.
Amen.
They looked pretty much the same, right. It wasn't like a real black-white issue like we've had here in this country for so many years. It was more of a cultural thing. How would we put that? Think about a culture. I could think of a bunch of them. But a culture you know nothing about, you'll be very uncomfortable in. You don't understand their language, don't have an interest in understanding their language. You don't like their food, you don't like where they live. Okay? That kind of thing was the tension. Except for, now let's add that in, this culture is communist and we're a democracy. Okay? That's a big difference. For a long time, we hated the communists and they hated us. That's the kind of tension that was here, just so you understand in our understanding what that was about. Again, it wasn't a color thing, it was a cultural thing. People can be, I don't want to call it racism, but you can have some cultural differences and still create the same kind of problems you have with the race. Oh, you're Chinese. Get away. Of course, that would be a racial thing, too. That would be a racial thing. But let's say North and South in the Civil War, both were white people fighting each other over a subject of slavery, basically, and some other things that were going on here. It wasn't just about slavery. That's the kind of thing we're looking at here. There's a big culture to this day between the North and the South, but we don't hate each other anymore as much as we used to. So I just kind of bring that around. I don't think a lot of us understand a lot of times what the Jews and the Gentiles were going through. All right, God's people are not automatically exempt from difficulties of life. Sometimes we get the impression from preachers that all you got to do is turn your life over to Jesus and everything will be roses from there on out. Wine and roses and fancy food and lots of fruit and also enjoyment. You never get too hot, never get too cold. Life is going to be perfect. All you got to do is commit to Jesus. Is that true?
Absolutely not.
No. But the Bible does say your needs will be provided. Not your wants. And not your desires, not your lusts, but your needs. And you know, I've never been rich. The most amount of money I ever made in my life was $38,000. That was pretty good for the day. But I ain't nowhere near that now. You know how many meals I missed in my life? I mean, total day. I've never gone a single day without at least 1 or 2 meals. And I ain't that smart. Okay? Okay. I just kind of roll with things most of the time. Okay? It's like this is how it's happened. God's provided a way for me. And I appreciate that. That's why people, kind of get, some of my friends through the years have gotten aggravated with me. Some of them had some businesses and didn't understand why I didn't do something like this. Well, I had a little cab driver business, but it's not quite the same because there's no money in that, no big money in that, not like it used to be. Huh? He was supplying my needs, right. I never missed a meal. Always had a place to sleep. I slept out in the cold one time, and that was by choice. Y'all don't want to hear the reason of that story, but that's what happened, okay? I slept in a field in Kettering overnight with my girlfriend at that time, all right? And there was a lot going on there. You might remember that, Gary. You was at home then. It was me and Cookie first met, yeah. Me and Mom got into it about something. Huh? It was by choice, yeah. I didn't want to go home and sleep in my own bed because we were having a fight with my mom. But that was by choice. I wasn't homeless. God has always blessed us. God's always found it. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to have difficulties. Okay, this was a faithful woman, this Jewish lady, who was Naomi, right? Yeah. Naomi was the Jewish lady. Yeah. She was coming from, what did it say? And there was a famine. And she went to Moab. Why would she go to the Gentile town of Moab? For the food. There was some food down there. See, Israel was having that country over there, Israel was having a famine. So she had to go take care of her family. So she went to Moab. She had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, Ephraimites of Bethlehem. And they came to the country of Moab. Now Elimelech, okay, so she had 2 sons and a husband. So what happened to her husband? We're going to get on into this a little bit later. Her husband died. I'm setting this up because think about this. You are going through a famine. The United States has a famine, or we have to go somewhere else to get some food. Your husband dies. Then your 2 sons find a couple of ladies that they want to marry from the Moabites, which was somewhat forbidden in the Jewish law. Do not mix people. Do not marry people who are out of your own culture, Jewish culture, primarily because of the thing of worshiping other idols. And they died. Okay? So this woman has lost her father, her husband, and her 2 sons, and now she has 2 daughters-in-laws, which was somewhat of a blessing. Okay? So she's totally alone. Difficulties happen. And I don't think there's anyone here who's ever doubted this woman's faithfulness to her God. Because when you have a Moabite, we're going to get to the end of the story, when you have a lady who's not familiar with the culture of God and the faith that they had in God, she wasn't familiar with that, but because of her example, we don't hear her preaching to her. We don't hear her every time, you got to get right or go to hell, you got to get right or go to hell, you got to get right, God's not going. I don't see anything in that in here. It was about a relationship between them. They learned to be friends. And by example, how strong is your example? That can go a long way. A lot of times the example doesn't really say anything other than you've got something that needs to be paid attention to because you're different than everybody else. So that's important to remember in relationships, especially we don't have to go preaching all the time. I've mentioned to y'all before about my relatives. They're all past now, but every time I didn't like to see him come at all. Because every time they would sit down with me and tell me, because I was the churchy kid, you know, I was the one that was really into the church thing, you know, and I studied the Bible, read the Bible and all that. And they would always tell me, you got to do it this way, telling me how we do things. It's how you're doing things that's wrong. Why? When I read through the Bible, I don't see the Bible very well telling us how to do things, okay? It doesn't say you got to have a praise team. It doesn't say you can't have a praise team. It doesn't say you got to have a church building. It doesn't say you can't have a church building. So on and so forth like that. And stupid stuff has divided churches like that forever. It was the spirit of like, I'm going to come and try to set you right one more time, son. We've been doing this for the last 20 years almost, but once every 20 years I had to endure that. You remember who I'm talking about, don't you, Gary? And I didn't like to see them coming. If they had showed me more love, and if they had just showed me that they were practicing what they were telling me I needed to practice, then it might have been an entirely different story. But you're going to sit up there and tell me I need to do something that you're not even doing. Wait a minute. All because I'm going to a different church that has a little bit different way of doing things than you do. The doctrine was all the same, basically. But how you did it, you're wrong for doing it your way, and I'm right for doing it my way. There's nothing in that. These women had a relationship. I'm going to stress that. But the difficulty times came. I know all of us have had wonderful relationships in our lives at one time or another. Maybe it's not going on right now, but you had one time was in love. Okay? What was it? It was that way that person interacted with you that made the difference. That's important to remember. Even though they had hard times, they came together. The second practical point here, number 2, is that sometimes God chooses to allow circumstances that leave him as our only hope. Verses 3 through 5. Okay, it says this: Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Ophrah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion also, both of them, and the woman was left with 2 sons and her husband. Okay. So, what has happened here? They're all of a sudden married in Moab. Doing something that's a little bit questionable. The questionable thing was we have Jews mixing with Gentiles. That wasn't supposed to happen. Do y'all know anywhere where God tells them that they're lost because they did that in this? No. They were not supposed to marry, the Jewish boys were not supposed to marry Gentiles. Okay? But they did. I don't see anywhere here where God says, and they were lost because they did that. The reason I bring that up is that so many times, the way I was brought up was, the Old Testament was full of harsh letters and harsh punishment, and, it was impossible to follow, and all that is true. But God still had some mercy. Okay? The circumstances that leave him as the only choice, the only hope. So what was going on here? Again, she's had her sons who are married. So sometimes, have you ever been in a time like that where you're like, man, what else can I do? Everything I've tried isn't working out. I know all of us have had situations like that, where you're just at the end of your rope. And I'll sometimes tell people, I saw this little poster when I was in the Air Force back in the 70s, remember when black light posters and all that were popular? Did you do that, Geraldine? Black light posters and posters and stuff, and you didn't do that? Well, the guys I hung out, we did that. And this guy had a cat on a rope. And the rope was tied at the bottom, and he was looking up. We just had this terrible look on his face, and he said, when you're at the end of your rope, tie a knot. I've done that a lot. I mean, when I'm just like, wow, and I sit down and pray, Lord, where's the knot? Or I got to tie this knot to wait on you to do something for me, please. I don't know what to do. And I keep on keeping on. And then eventually, boom, there'll be a light over there. Oh, that looks like it's the way to go. God will show us the way. But we have to turn to Him first, right? It's something we have to do. We have to realize, Lord. And when you're in a relationship, and when you're in a situation where your relationships are going flat, okay? Her husband's died, and her son, her sons are about to die in a little bit, but she turns to God when things get worse. The wise person recognizes that every good thing is from God. Turn to Sister Loris, will you turn to Matthew 5:45, and Sister Geraldine, turn to James 1:17. Matthew 5:45. These are a couple of scriptures here in reference to that. And you may notice that these sound almost exactly alike. Matthew 5:45, you ready? He goes, why? He causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. What'd you say? Read that again for me, I'm sorry. Okay. The wise person recognizes that every good thing is from God. Okay, James 1:17. Okay. Does God make good things happen to His people, and then He makes bad things happen to His who are not His people? Does He make separations like that? No. Now, the truth is this, though. The Bible does say this. God chastens. What's chasten mean? What's chasten mean? Huh? What does it mean to chasten? Discipline. Discipline. Remember when you ever been disciplined and it was fun to be disciplined? No, it's not fun to be disciplined. I don't care what kind of discipline it is. That's the discipline. You did something you weren't supposed to do. Now you're going to suffer a little bit to try to teach you not to do that again. That's the purpose, a whole purpose of discipline. It's not just a punishment thing. It's a learning process. So the Bible says that God disciplines us. You could say this, that if you're a Christian, I've heard pastors say this a couple of times in his sermons, you can't expect to be troubleless because the devil's not happy that you're a Christian. you're going to get some trouble. It's going to follow you. Where in the world do people get this idea that everything's going to be perfect now that I'm a Christian? I have actually heard television evangelists. This is why I don't watch them too much anymore, because I can't watch them. I watch some of them for their style. You know, that's about all I try to learn from them. But where in the world do they get this idea that if you're a Christian, all things are going to go well? God's going to give you every desire you have in your heart. No. No. Right. Yeah, we've never yet, I always say yet, because I can see it on the horizon, okay, have been persecuted for our beliefs in this country. Other countries have. Other countries still today. China does it at this very moment. They have killed Christians for their testimony. If you're a real active preachery kind of Christian, you could go to jail or even face death in China today. We're going to have some troubles. We're going to have some problems because the devil is trying to get us to go back to him, to be dancing a little bit more with him than we have before. Number 4 here on the practical points, no matter how difficult or how uncertain the outcome, take the next biblical step. Read verse 7 again. Let me read verse 7 of Ruth 1. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. Where would you go if you were in a different country and things went flat? I mean, flat meaning bad. You lose your husband, you lose your 2 sons, you now have two daughters-in-law that you're responsible for. And keep in mind, in this day, it wasn't like today. A woman just couldn't go down to 7-Eleven to get them a job, or Walmart and get them a job working a register and making decent money. You didn't have a man, you had basically one choice. And that is learn how to work your charms on a man, if y'all get what I'm saying. Because he was your only source of income without that. Or you could become a maid and work your charms on your employer if he wasn't married, okay? Something like that was the options. That's the only options that you had. But what did they do? I can go back home, back to where I came from. Why was that a choice, y'all think? Just human nature? That's what they knew, exactly. I know people back there. One of the reasons I came back to Dayton, okay, I had a little bit of family here. My family was here. That's what I was familiar with. I knew the streets. I drove a cab for 4 or 5 years before I went into the Air Force. And, well, actually, after I came out, before I went into ministry, I drove a cab for 4 or 5 years. So I knew the streets. I knew I could go back to that because I did it some in Atlanta. It was comfortable. Atlanta was not. I didn't know nobody. The only person I knew, I had to move from that location. So that's human nature again. So we tend to go to what we're familiar with. Just as a side note, I'm going to go on to number 5 here in a second. Just as a side note, that's one thing that bothers a lot of people who are recovering from sin. You notice how I phrase that? Do we ever stop sinning? No. But we try to recover from it in the sense that we try to do better in the future than we have in the past. But the devil doesn't want us to do that. It's going to be constantly, constantly. That's a danger to going back to what you're familiar with. When I came back to Dayton, I was familiar with a lot of things I shouldn't have been familiar with to begin with. And some of those things kind of haunted me. So that's one disadvantage. So you got two advantages. You've got people that are there you've got established relationships from people in the past that could go back to. However, that's also an influence to us. And then that's a bad thing to it. So everything has an upside and a downside. Okay. So what did they do? They took the next biblical step, which was to turn back to God. They went back to the godly people of home. Our own difficulties should never include our desires for God blessings on others. Let me see. Maybe I read that wrong. Our own difficulties should never preclude our desire for God's blessings on others. Well, what in the world would you explain that to? Let's look at verse 8 and 9. It says here that Naomi said unto her two daughters-in-law, Go, return each to your mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. Basically, she's not just saying, y'all go home, good luck. Good knowing you later. Have a good one, bye. That's not what she was saying, is it? There's a little bit more here. What was a little bit more she added to that? The Lord deal with you how? Kindly. The Lord deal with you kindly. This is the kind of woman she was. This is why I wanted to stress this. We need to realize that people around us, once they find out we're a Christian and we don't respond that way, we're going to push them away instead of bring them in. Okay? That doesn't take nothing spectacular. You don't have to be a Bible scholar, be able to quote scriptures all the time. The thing is, reflect the life of Jesus. That is simple Christianity. What does a Christian mean? What did the word Christ follower? Yeah, a Christian. One from Christ. If you're one from Christ, you need to kind of look a little bit like Christ, or at least act a little bit like Christ, and not like the heathens out on the street. Okay? That's my point. I said, this lady, this Jewish lady, gave them the blessings with God. They said, may God deal with you, deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. These were Gentiles. The Jewish lady telling them, I see some good in y'all. That's a progress in a relationship, isn't it? All your life you've been taught how rotten and how terrible the Gentiles were. They're good for nothing because they don't follow our God. And all of that may have been true. They weren't following the God of Abraham, but they were invited to. And a lot of Jews didn't want to do that. But we can't be too hard on Jews, because I've known Christians, when I was a preacher, to tell me we don't want sinners coming to this church.
Who do you want?
You hear that? We don't want sinners coming to church. Example, case in point, okay? I had a guy come to church, and I like to contact people. It's a small little church like us. And I got his phone number, and I called him and asked him if he'd like to have a Bible study. We were having a Bible study. He came to church a little more often. But one Sunday, he made the mistake of coming to church with liquor on his breath. And they said, did you know he drinks? He's a known alcoholic in town. What's he doing coming here? And y'all kind of know me by now. I said this little cute little remark. I was upset at him. I said, well, I guess he's coming to find out a little bit about God. And it shut him down. I got a couple of dirty looks, and because I just thought that you're complaining because he's got liquor on his breath. And I was wondering, okay. He was so ignored, nobody would shake his hand, nobody would speak to him except me. My wife spoke to him, but she didn't stay and talk very long with him. I was so upset, agitated, embarrassed, all those things were like, wow. They told me they didn't want to come back no more. May the Lord go with you and deal with you as kindly as you dealt with me. We need to always think about that, no matter what. How many of y'all would be here if they didn't allow sinners in this church? If sinners were not allowed in this church, how many of y'all would be here? I wouldn't be here.
Totally empty.
It'd be totally empty, okay? That's the point. That's the point. I've had at other churches, those similar kind of things. There's always one or two in a church that think sinners don't belong in the church. That's crazy. But Ruth wasn't that way, and she wasn't that way. He says, I like that. That's more of the relationship kind of thing I wanted to look at. And the last one here on the chapter points back to point 6. Following God involves sacrifice, but also the hope of his sure provision. Verse 14 and 16. And they lifted up their